you get from me is a slightly expanded version of what Joe Perkins already touched upon, which is merger control, in particular in digital markets. And so starting point, I think, is really the assertion that competition policy enforcement is largely broken. I think that sort of claim is particularly made in relation to control of abuse of dominance and the GAFAMs, where there is a search for a regulatory solution outside competition law. But the claim is also made for merger control, both generally but in particular in relation to digital markets. And I want to take a closer look at the latter claim, and I want to cover in particular three aspects. So the first one is whether there's evidence of under-enforcement and hence the need for a more assertive merger control enforcement, either generally or in relation to the digital sector or in relation to strategic gatekeepers. Then secondly, I want to spend a bit of time, what are the building blocks on the levers for a more assertive merger control enforcement, and how can you change these levers? And then I want to discuss in particular the evaluation of 4 solutions which are being offered at the moment for a more assertive competition law enforcement. One is what I call the tightening of the screws within the existing legal framework. That's sort of what the CMA is doing at the moment. Then you have the second solution is a new substantive test, the balance of probability test, which is advocated in the Furman report. You've got the base proposal, which is even more radical, where you just lower the standard of proof from SLC more likely to a reasonable prospect of SLC. And then an even more innovative approach, which is being advocated by Tommaso Valletti and others, which is the reversal of burden of proof. So we're going with increased courage and enthusiasm into greater enforcement. So I'll go through all of these 4 in time. So if we start off with under-enforcement in merger control, and so what are the what is being raised as evidence of merger control under enforcement? So one are general statements of rise in concentration and market power. So this is, if you like, a macro perspective, not in the sense of macroeconomics, but in a broad brush overview of sectors, sometimes subsectors, rarely antitrust markets, but nevertheless there is evidence of increasing concentration and also increasing market power. Then secondly, we have a sort of type of numbers games, whereby, and Joe has already alluded to, and you'll get this here in 2 variations as well, where the answer is, there are many mergers. So in the EU, for example, you've got 8,000 mergers in the last, 30 years since 1990, and lo and behold, there are only 30 which have been prohibited. That is less than 0.4% of all mergers. Isn't that terrible? And of course, both of these challenges are can be contested. So in some way, if you like, the macro perspective, generally antitrust lawyers are uncomfortable if concentration goes up across a sector. The answer for us is, so what? What we work with is antitrust markets. And the second question in relation to the concentration is, okay, even if that's the case, how much of that is really the failure of merger control? So if we prohibited 60 or 100 mergers, would that picture have looked very differently? When it gets to the numbers game, similarly is really, are we measuring something which is reasonable? So is the 8,000 number not just a measure of a lack of targeting of merger control thresholds? So yes, you've got 8,000 mergers, but a lot of them are what we now would call simplified, in the sense they catch transactions where there's very limited competitive overlap. And then again, are the 30 cases really the right number? Or should you look at interventions, i.e. remedies, and prohibitions, in which case, if you look at intervention cases relative to non-simplified merger cases, you get to an intervention ratio of 8 to 10%, and that already looks sort of a bit more reasonable. But overall, I think what you're still left with is, with the increase in concentration and potentially market power, I think it's at least fair to ask, should we have a slightly more assertive merger control policy to do something about it? Now, in relation to digital markets, there are two other points which are being made. The first one is that developments in digital markets are hard to predict. What's the counterfactual? Could be whatever. Very hard to identify, in particular when the standard against which you have to measure it is more likely than not. It may well be that in digital markets you have lots of potential outcomes. All of them have a low probability, and some of them have a very extreme consumer harm scenario in them. So how do you deal with those type of mergers with the instruments we have at the moment? And then if we go one step further and say we don't only look at digital mergers, but we look at acquisitions of by gatekeepers, and obviously Joe and I have read the same papers by Tommaso's. You get your 1,000 and you get 0, and of course that is, as PR is obviously fantastic, but in terms of what the real numbers are, the real numbers is, for obvious reasons, a lot of them have been small acquisitions which were, if anything, more mechanisms of hiring people rather than mergers. So the real number is not 1,000, and if you look at it, the real number is also not 0. Again, some of the transactions had been subject to remedies, and you also, I think, need to take into account what are the numbers, the mergers which do not take place because either the GAFAMs or their advisors tell them that that's not going to fly. So the 0 is also not the right number. So then the second point being made is what I call sort of ex post remorse by the competition authorities, who say, look, haven't we got it wrong in the past? And the poster cases are always Google DoubleClick and Facebook Instagram or Facebook WhatsApp. And Google DoubleClick, I'm a bit biased because I was acting as a complainant against this transaction, and I still think this is one where you could have seen at the time, because that's the real test, not 10 years later. At the time, was that a bright idea? And you can at least make a case that at the time it wasn't. It was a deal which has cemented Google's dominant position in the ad tech market. Facebook, Instagram, I think is a similar issue. I mean, Facebook, Instagram, it's worth mentioning, is a phase 1 clearance. So it's not even that this was looked at in any way. So one of the things we'll come back to is it may not always be just more powers. Sometimes it's just sort of a question about better analysis, and that is far harder to, so I think, Joe, we're on the same page there. It's far harder to stipulate how you can sort of look at cases more intelligently. But at the same time, I think one thing also to remember is agencies have to learn, and they are lagging behind in the understanding of the markets, like lawyers more generally, maybe less so economists. And then the last point which is always made, again, Joe has touched upon it already, the role of killer acquisitions, which in some ways is, again, a nice label, but comes from the pharmaceutical industry, I think, where it is appropriate, where you have some acquisitions are being made with the aim of closing down sort of research or products in pipeline in order to protect existing products. I think in the context of the tech industry, you sometimes have motivations of acquisition in order to neutralize a threat. But very often what you also may have, and that is not mutually exclusive, the willingness to innovate, because now it is something you control. And therefore, one of the questions is, like Facebook, WhatsApp, and Facebook, Instagram, sort of where would the target companies have been in the absence of ownership of Facebook? So the counterfactual may well have been a somewhat different outcome than what we see at the moment. Where does that leave us overall in terms of assessment of under-enforcement? I think the overall trend towards increased concentration seems to be real and increased market power. So I think it's also clear that merger control has not prevented this trend. What is less clear is whether merger control could have prevented this trend, or indeed whether there is strong under-enforcement. But what there is clearly a case for, given this trend, is really to say, take a close look and saying, is merger control working effectively? And are there things which you can actually improve upon? And what are the proposals which are in circulation? Is that the way to go about it? So if we then look at the 4 building blocks of substantive merger control, rules, I'll start with the first 2, the consumer welfare framework. So I'm glad to see that most proposals actually do not touch on the consumer welfare analytical framework, i.e. to see are consumers worse off as a result of the transaction. I think that in itself it tends to be not in doubt, which obviously then comes in 2 flavors. One is the question of, is competition being reduced, and does that lead to consumer harm? Secondly, do you have efficiencies which compensate or overcompensate consumers for any loss of competition? Now, in practice, that is a framework which can be tightened, so you can, in principle, install lower thresholds of price increases you're willing to bear. So instead of saying, look, 3 to 5% is where we intervene, you can have a lower number. And the CMA has done that in Sainsbury's Asda, where you say my tolerance level is 0.1% or no price increase whatsoever. So there are ways in which you can actually sharpen that and change the outcomes, and we'll come back to that point. I think the second lever is merger presumptions. And there are some who say, look, it's a mistake that mergers have, or merger control policy works on the presumption that mergers are either competitively neutral or efficiency enhancing. And if you look at how merger control works, then it is indeed the case that there is what we lawyers call the concentration privilege. So if you look at how you compare, let's say, a price fixing between 2 small companies under Article 101, where even if they have no impact on the market, that is presumptively unlawful. However, if these 2 firms merge, then you won't have only the loss of pricing competition, you have the loss of whatever competition between them. But there's, if you like, there is no presumptiveness and unlawfulness in the context of merger control. So, but if you look at it, the presumption doesn't really come from, if you like, a positive presumption of merger control. It comes from a negative presumption of Article 101, where certain types of arrangements have a negative presumption. But this is clearly something which, if you wanted to, you could change. And it is also true because the merger, the price increase at which agencies intervene isn't 0, it's 3 or 5%. So inherently you have some form of positive presumption with which you're willing to live and say, look, if the price increase is modest, we assume there are some efficiencies, and therefore we are willing to tolerate this. And again, that is something, a lever which you can play with. And again, we'll come to one of the examples how that can be done. The other 2 levers, just very briefly, is one is the balancing of competitive harm and efficiencies. That is something which economists love, but it doesn't happen in practice. So I think if you look at how merger control is actually implemented, what you have is either you have a case where the authorities are happy that there is no harm to competition, in which case you don't have to bother about efficiencies, or there is a harm to competition, in which case in practice it's virtually impossible to reverse that burden of proof, and therefore nobody bothers with efficiencies either. So it's a balancing which only happens on one side in practice and not on the other. But one of the things to be considered is if you were to change your presumptions and start with negative presumptions, you could actually do that if you're then willing to accept actual efficiencies where they occur. The problem with this is, one of the reasons, in my view, the key reason why you don't have the balancing is that it is the same entity which assesses efficiencies and competitive harm. So, and that agency wants to limit the litigation risk. So if they are of the view they want to prohibit, they will not only establish competitive harm, they will also downplay the efficiencies. And if they want to sort of approve a transaction, then all they have to do is actually not find competitive harm. So if you want to have a proper balancing, what you need to do is set up a prosecutorial system where the agency looks at competitive harm, the parties establish efficiencies, and you've got a court system which will then actually do the balancing. In my view, that's the only way you can deal with that particular problem. Lastly, remedies. So I think remedies is another area where a lot of sort of more ex post evaluation would be helpful. I think there's a lot of confidence that may be actually misguided in some of the remedies, but it's something which should definitely be done more. In particular also because in mergers in digital markets, behavioral remedies will get more important because a lot of the theories of harm in digital mergers are vertical or conglomerate theories of harm, and very often there is no divestment solution to that problem. So the question is, can the authorities live with a behavioral remedy, or are they actually ineffective? And that's a really important question. And what you see in practice at the moment is that the view of agencies diverge. So you look at the CMA is dead against behavioral remedies in digital mergers, and even where they don't have jurisdiction, as they did in Google Fitbit, they felt the need to go out and say, if we had a word in this, we would not have approved that transaction subject to behavioral remedies. If you look at the European Commission, they are far more accommodating, particularly if their theories of harm are somewhat speculative. So you look at LSE Refinitiv, where they went out on a limb with their theory of harm, but in return they were very lenient in the way in which the behavioral remedies were accepted. What could explain the difference? Personally, I think it's the standard of legal review. So in the UK, you have a very weak legal standard, and so the CMA can actually be far more independent in the way it operates. The European Commission, by contrast, has the Luxembourg courts on their back far more, and therefore they have to be more careful when merging parties will go to appeal. Again, this is a sort of, I think, something which Joe also mentioned, which is to say institutional design matters. Even for substantive analysis, it's absolutely vital. So these, if you like, were the four levers I wanted to just sort of briefly discuss. And now comes really the fun part, which is sort of the four solutions, if you like. So here you can see is the enforcement sort of policy on a graph of the CMA over the last years. What you can see is the yellow line is referrals, phase 2 referrals as a matter of total cases. And it's a bit like global warming. It's not completely black and white, but funnily enough, the three highest referral numbers were the last 3 years. What does that tell you? I think it's at least sort of tendency is upwards. What is more dramatic is actually blocked or abandoned phase 2, where you see over the last, until 19, it was broadly between whatever 4% and 8% were sort of the number of cases which were either blocked or abandoned. And this is percentage of all cases, not phase 2 cases. That has shot up to 13, 20, whatever it is, 23, I think, and 18%. So you're now more than doubling in the last 2 years the prohibition cases. It's an interesting narrative if you hear the CMA leadership. It's a shame that Michael is no longer there, and you basically get two stories. If you speak to the leadership with economic background, they say, of course, so we've changed our policy, we're far more aggressive, made a mistake in the past. If you speak to CMA leadership with a legal background, they are of course far more nervous that they have changed the policy without having a change in the legal test. And so their story is, well, you know, numbers go up and and down, and sort of, yeah, it's a bit high at the moment, but sort of was high in the past as well. And furthermore, sort of to the extent you can't explain it with variation in numbers, it's largely due to companies who have now pursued a far more aggressive merger policy, and they now do crazy things which they haven't done in the past. Personally, I find the economists more convincing than the lawyers on that particular point. But what it shows is that you have a lot of leeway in tightening the screws and changing merger control policy, even with an existing framework. Two caveats. The first one is obviously, which I just mentioned earlier, is provided you have a very weak judicial review system, so you can basically do you have an enormous amount of discretion. And I think, quite frankly, as a lawyer, I would be happier if a very significant shift in policy would somehow be reflected in a shift in the legal test. It's just sort of more hygienic that way. Let's look at the balance of probability tests, where this would replace a likely SLC test with a test which would establish whether SLC is there on the balance of probability. So what would that actually change? So it would not only catch cases where harm is more likely than not, but it would also catch cases where the likelihood of harm is very low, but the magnitude of harm is very big. So this is maybe only 10%, but the 10% are so catastrophic because you lose the only potential challenger to a gatekeeper that on balance you should still intervene. Now, what I like about the test is at least it's intellectually sort of coherent. And it would also lead to stricter enforcement policy in digital markets because because of the problem I've mentioned earlier, it's very hard to demonstrate particular outcomes with high likelihood. I think where the test falls down is on practicalities. Maybe that's has been written by economists, but so I think the one is that the test presumes a level of sophistication, namely that you are able to identify a probability of a particular outcome and that you can measure that outcome with sufficient certainty to be able to apply that test. And at least, maybe I've always got the wrong cases, but in my cases, that's not the case. It's more finger in the air and more likely than not. So I think it is not particularly practicable, and if you all you want to do is that you want to capture certain cases where you think the outcome is catastrophic, quite frankly, you have that test already, as the CMA has shown. I think the other concern goes back to my balancing exercise. If you want to have this type of balancing exercise, you need a different institutional setup, and you would have to have a really revamp and move towards a prosecutorial system in order to make that work at all. So now we come to my favorite, which is the lowering of the standard of proof. So this is, if you like, this is not if you like, a slightly mad academic who had an idea and has started this. This is in the base proposal for reform of digital mergers, namely to say, wouldn't it be a good idea that instead of having to establish that harm is more likely than not, the prohibition standard will be the same as what is now the opening of phase 2, which is I will be able to intervene. In fact, it's more extreme. I will be forced to intervene as long as it can be established that a competitive harm is a reasonable prospect. Now, the one thing which is clear that if you install that change, then obviously you have a dramatic sort of tightening of merger control enforcement. But it has this stricter enforcement comes at a price of a huge number of drawbacks. The first one is that actually it implements what is an irrational policy, because you are forced to intervene in mergers which you have found on balance to be pro-competitive, and it's really no one has been able to explain to me why that is a good idea. And you would also then have to find remedies. So what is your remedy in a world where you say, on balance, this is actually a good deal? So are you going to force the parties to divest something, or are you going to impose behavioral remedies? Sort of in those scenarios, completely unclear. I suspect what the government has in mind, but I don't know, is that becomes then a discretion of the CMA. So they could intervene, but they don't have to intervene as they do at the moment. I mean, the other problems, of course, is that it's very hard to administer. Courts have an idea as to what more likely than not means. What is a reasonable prospect is I think, far harder to administer. And the other thing which is also interesting is this is not just digital markets. This is all acquisitions by firms with strategic market status, which means if they acquire outside the digital market, that test is also applicable. And now, sort of, just if you think it couldn't get sort of more interesting, the last proposal is one which Tommaso Valletti has put forward, which I actually find quite interesting. So this is one where you start off with a rebuttable structural presumption of harm, where you say every merger is bad, and then it is the burden is on the merging parties to show that there are countervailing efficiencies, or there are facts in that particular scenario why there is no price increase. And this is clearly, if you like, the fruits of his time as chief economist, when he was frustrated with all the lawyers and economists who would just be doubt merchants saying, but this doesn't work and this doesn't work when you haven't proven this. So he said, look, why don't we change this? And then actually the companies which have the resources should actually then come up with the answers. Now, the other thing he also sort of put in there, saying not only is the burden of proof is changed, but also the parties would have an obligation to demonstrate that the benefits cannot be obtained in any other way than through the merger. Now, for those sort of the lawyers among us, there's obviously, this is the equivalent on Article 101. One of the requirements is to show that that there is no less restrictive way or no other way in which the benefits can be achieved. The impact is really, it aligns merger control with the merger control enforcement policy. So I think that in principle would be a good thing. And it would certainly lead to a significant more aggressive merger control policy than so far. The problem is at the moment, normally presumptions are there as a result of long years of experience. And at the moment, it's not clear with what presumptions you would actually work in the case of merger control. Would you say we presume that there is a 5% price increase, a 10% increase, whatever, but you need to have something on which you base your presumptions in order to make that workable. The second problem is, of course, while the parties have a lot of information as far as they are concerned, they have no information about the markets, or sort of at least not unless it's publicly available, and they have certainly no information about their competitors. Otherwise, we've got other competition problems. And so sort of the authorities have obviously the information gathering powers, and it would be very hard for the merging parties to establish quite a number of what they're now being forced to establish. And then the last point, just briefly to touch upon, is this Article 101 equivalent, where, quite frankly, this hasn't been really thought through, because you cannot have the same obligation under Article 101 and merger control. Because if you go a merger control rule, presumably you could do it under 101, but under 101 you would have then the same problem you could do it under merger control. So you would never be able to show that the benefit could never be achieved in any other way. So it's a catch-22, and I don't know whether Tommaso did that on purpose to say. So basically, there's never a transaction which will ever be approved. But I think if you go down that route, this needs to be further thought through. But I think it's an interesting, if you look at these four solutions, they give you an interesting idea of what sort of a more aggressive merger control policy should look like. To conclude, so I think I fall into the category of people who are uncomfortable with this macro considerations jumping to micro conclusions. So if we want to do that, I think we need more sort of a better understanding what the link is between merger control and an increase in sort of enforcement of merger control or not. What I do find interesting, I think more time should be spent on, is on the presumptions of merger control. What is it sort of? What is the right presumption for mergers? And are they neutral on average, or are they not? Because I think that should indeed shape merger control policy, and we're far away from having a clear answer to that. And then I think none of the authorities spend enough time to see whether remedies actually work. So if I would ever go to an enforcer, I think that would be an important area to say, look, 8 to 10% of all relevant cases are subject to remedies, and most of the time I have no clue whether that works, nor do I care. In fact, you have sort of a conflict of interest that the people who have impose the remedy, the last thing they want to know is that it hasn't worked. So you would have to have almost a different organization who would run through that analysis. Then I think there is a need to preserve a rational analytical framework. I think I would have thought that's self-evident, but in the light of Bay's proposal, it clearly isn't. And then I think one of the things where I've changed a lot is where previously I would have thought you shouldn't do crazy cases. I think you should. I think you should sort of have a sandbox where you try things out, because otherwise you're always in this sort of little narrow bubble where you never try something out and you never know whether something works. So in that sense is, if you want to shift merger control, do it in a very narrow area and see what happens, rather than really trying it out in a big car crash for the whole of merger control. Thank you very much.
Can we squeeze in a quick question, if anyone in the room? Yes, Joe, go ahead.
So I thought really interesting presentation. I agree completely on this, the difficulties of balancing harms and benefits,
Yeah.
right? I come from a cost-benefit analysis background. I think this is just absolutely standard, but it just never happens in practice. You say you could do that via a court system, but of course in principle the panel system is supposed to give something of that. Does that happen at all in practice? Is there any way that you could change the panel system to make it?
Sure, but it just goes against the grain at the moment. What you want is streamlined systems. You don't want to get sort of an independent person who comes in, because you need to teach them again. So I think if anything, you move away from what used to be the quasi-judicial system of the CMA. And therefore, I mean, the CMA could still implement it in some way of shape, but it's completely against where they want to go.
So you could do it, but they have no desire.
Yeah, exactly. So,
is there time? Okay. I wonder if you could speculate as to what would happen if the UK did adopt the Bay's proposals in terms of merger review with respect to the UK globally, because I kind of wonder if the UK is taking a much more restricted standards when it reviews mergers that do have some UK nexus, but let's say something like Amazon, MGM, don't have that much UK nexus. What response do you think, or what would the behaviour of companies like that be to that kind of regime?
Look, I think there are two dimensions to this. One is sort of the intergovernment dimension. So there may come a time when Brussels, or actually the US, may get annoyed that the UK prohibits deals which they think are acceptable, and where the center of gravity actually sits either in the US or in Europe, but certainly not in the UK. Although sometimes you also think whether some of the US agencies are quite happy about the UK actually doing the sort of the dirty work for what they can't and the courts don't allow them. But the second one is then indeed the question you ask, which is what about the companies? In Facebook Giphy, you already, if you read the Facebook submissions, there is already the slight threat which says actually maybe we could take you to a US court and you try to enforce a remedy which is largely a divestment between two US companies, and we're really looking forward to that. So I think the CMA has to be careful as to, it's a bit like the story in the Little prince of Saint-Exupéry. It's fine if you ask the sun to rise in the morning, but you have to be careful if you push your luck too far in that direction.
Super, thanks very much, Christian.
Thanks.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.